And so now Michael will speak to us about how to stay positive in abruptly disturbing times. Michael.
Thank you, Terry. Well, it's good to be back with you all. And I'm going to try something new. I'm going to actually, last time I didn't use any slides, but this time I worked on the sermon yesterday, and I've got some really gorgeous slides that I'd like to try to use. So let me go on screen share here. So I've slightly adapted the title, Beyond Hope and Fear, Staying Mostly Positive in Abruptly Disturbing Times. The first thing I want to say is that denial gets a bad rap. Denial has evolved in us for very good reasons. I'm talking about the largely unconscious habit of thought, whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. So we all have denial instincts. I do, you do, everybody we know does. So we can have compassion for ourselves and each other. And if you wake up tomorrow morning, or if you decide an hour from now that I'm just full of malarkey and you don't agree with anything, I'll be okay with that, and you can be okay with that too. I've heard of denial. I just don't believe in it. Burying my head in the sand over climate change is much easier now that half the world has turned to desert. It's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And who of us can't relate to this one? My desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. So, beyond hope and fear, staying mostly positive in abruptly disturbing times. 4 main points. The first I suggest is that we would do well to remember who and what we are, your cultural self, your universal self, and your mortal self. We are living in an unsustainable culture. We're living in an anti-future culture. We're not living in an indigenous, healthy, pro-future culture. And so there are basic human universal needs. These scholars on the bottom have been researching this, and I found this first time from Dave Pollard, that are not being met for most of us in industrial society. The first is the need for habitable climate and healthy, non-toxic air, water, food, and shelter. The need to belong to and connect with a safe and engaging community, starting with attachment to one's mother in the critical first years of life. The need for meaning and purpose in one's life, including meaningful work. The need to be valued, appreciated, and heard. The need to be optimistic, or at least relatively positive, about the future for oneself and one's loved ones. The need for control and a degree of autonomy over one's life and work. The need to be in regular, intimate communion with the living world. The need for a sense of place and home. And the need for freedom from chronic stress, financial, physical, etc., and the time and space to recover from it, including getting adequate sleep. Now, the first thing to know about these universal human needs that are true for all humans in all cultures at all times is that these were met in spades in healthy, indigenous, pro-future cultures. And these are not met, many of these are not met in industrial, anthropocentric, human-centered, rather than life-centered cultures. So that's the first thing we would do well to remember. Percy Shelley, back in 1812, said, "I am the eye with which the universe beholds itself and knows it is divine." The sense that we are not separate from nature, we're a part of nature, we're an outgrowth of nature, that we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. Carl Sagan famously said, "We are the local embodiment of a cosmos grown to self-awareness. We've begun to contemplate our origins, star stuff, pondering the stars." Brian Swim is a physicist who's worked very closely with Thomas Berry, who died about a decade ago. And he says, 4 billion years ago, Earth was molten rock, and now it sings opera. The sense that we grow out of the planet in the same way that apples grow out of apple trees. We're organically related to this larger body of life. Earth is your larger body, your larger self. And in that sense, this isn't so much a picture of a human being looking at the Earth. This is a picture of a piece of Earth that became complex enough that it could get off of itself and look back at itself. We are the Earth becoming aware of itself. And then finally, it's important, living mostly positive in abruptly challenging times, we need to understand that we are part of this body of life. And when we die, we're still part of this body of life. The gifts of death. Connie created this litany, because when we remember who we are, including our mortality, fear of death dissipates, and what matters most becomes blazingly obvious. Mountains die, oceans die, continents die. Without the death of species, there would be no complex life. Without the death of fetal cells in the embryonic stage of development, we'd all be spheres. The reason we have shape is because cells died here, 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 and here. Without the death of plants and animals, there would be no food. Without the death of stars, there would be no periodic table of elements, no planets, no life. Without the death of elders, there would be no room for children. Without death, there would be no ancestors. Without death, time would not be precious. What then are the gifts of death? The gifts of death are Mars and Mercury, Saturn and Earth. The gifts of death are the atoms of stardust within our bodies. The gifts of death are the splendors of shape and form and color. The gifts of death are diversity, the immense journey of life. The gifts of death are food, the sustenance of life. The gifts of death are seeing, hearing, feeling, deeply feeling. The gifts of death are the urgency to act, the desire to fully be and become. The gifts of death are joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. The gifts of death are lives that are fully and exuberantly lived, then graciously and gratefully given up for now and forevermore. Amen. So what we've discovered scientifically, the global collective intelligence that is reflected in our global scientific community, is that death is natural and necessary at every level of reality, and death is no less sacred than life. Or as philosopher of religion and religious naturalist friend and colleague of ours, Loyal Rue, says, death is the entrance fee paid on exiting. So remembering who and what you are, your cultural self, your universal self, your mortal self. Also, it helps significantly to accept where you are in time, that is where you are in history and space, that we're actually part of a collapsing, contracting system. So back about 2 years ago, the BBC did a deep civilization series. Are we on the road to civilizational collapse? And Luke Kemp had this article. It showed 88 ancient civilizations just between 3000 BCE and 1000 of the Common Era. If you go back before 3000 BCE, or if you look at the last 1,000 years, it's actually well over 100. Turns out that collapse is a feature, not a bug. It's a feature of anthropocentric, that is human-centered civilizations, rather than ecocentric or life-centered cultures. Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian, said, great civilizations are not murdered. They take their own lives. They do themselves in. And we know how that happens. How civilizations commit suicide or ecocide. This is just the last 5% of human history, okay? The last 8,000 years, as opposed to, say, 2.5 million years of Homo habilis and 400,000 years of Homo sapiens. We know of over 80 examples of this. This is the process. Roughly, it usually takes between 225 and 325 years. We see progress, rise, boom, overshoot of carrying capacity. That's we use more resources and we exude more waste than the system can bear, and it starts breaking down. And then regress, fall, bust. And process, collapse is a process. It's not an event. It usually takes more than a century. And our feelings, it matters. If you're born and you die in times of progress, rise, boom, then, progress isn't a belief. It's an experienced fact. Things have gotten easier and better and wealthier for many people, obviously not the slaves and civilizations that had slaves. But if you're born and you die in times of fall, of regress, well, of course, you expect that your children are going to have it more difficult than you. I mean, it's just the way things are. It's when we're born and we die, when we're born in expansion, and then it shifts in our lifetime, That's what we call suffering, and that's where all of us on this call are at. Richard Heinberg famously said, our core ecological problem is not climate change. It is overshoot, of which global warming is a symptom. I did a whole hour and 20-minute presentation where this was the main thesis. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out-of-control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. In fact, if you just Google great acceleration, you'll find dozens of charts. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order, those legitimately concerned about the consequences of collapse, and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up. And yes, that paragraph means all of us virtually. The history of 80+ previous boom and bust, progress regress societies clearly reveals how and why industrial civilization is taking its own life. Paradoxically, acceptance may be the only thing that can help us not make a bad situation worse and help us to live fully and love the life we live, even at Teotihuacan, which is the end of the world as we know it. And the end of the world as we know it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world full stop, but it does mean the end of a way of living that all of us have grown accustomed to. Honor the stages of grief. This brings up challenging feelings for all of us, myself included. Honor the stages of grief. This quote from Joanna Macy, the depth of your grief is the measure of your love. You wouldn't feel grief if you weren't in love. Stephen Jenkinson, the famous death worker, said, grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful or hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. So the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief, denial, as I said before, denial sometimes gets a bad rap. Oftentimes it's just adaptive inattention. I mean, there's lots of people who aren't in denial of climate change. They're not in denial of overshoot. They're not in denial of collapse, but they need to have a good life and wake up inspired to do their work or be with their kids or grandkids or whatever, so they don't pay attention to it. And that's actually healthy. It's called adaptive inattention. Many of us get angry. We start blaming the fossil fuel industry or whatever. But the truth of the matter is these are patterns that have been at work for 7,000 years of anthropocentric, human-centered civilization. So the blame game doesn't really make any sense. Bargaining, if we all just shifted to solar panels and wind turbines and a Green New Deal and a green capitalism, and that's the bargaining phase. Depression, sadness, we all go there. There's nobody that wakes up to this stuff that doesn't go through these. And sometimes we cycle back again and again. But then coming to that place of acceptance, that's what I've devoted my life to try to get people to move through sort of the fear and the anger and the bargaining and depression to get to acceptance and then finding the gift and local love and action. It's beyond acceptance. It's finding the gift of where you can be a blessing. And then some people get to the place of gallows humor, which I think is pretty healthy. I like this one. Please note, the post-apocalyptical fiction section has been moved to current affairs. Who can't relate to that? And then finally, devote yourself truly to daily, weekly, and monthly compassionate love and action. Like make a commitment, because there's always people that are going to have it worse than you. There's always people that are going to be struggling. There's going to be people that are going to be staying in denial longer. So the impacts are going to hit them harder when reality bites. There's always a way to exercise compassionate love and action. And I like love and action better than activism. Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. We need courage, not hope, to face climate change. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. And I love this one, Chris Martin said, plant a garden, meet your neighbors, practice generosity, learn new skills, control what you can, and leave the rest. And this is actually some months old. My granddaughter here in Ypsilanti, Michigan, is now just started walking this past week. So this is an outdated picture, but this is what I've given my life to, is to be here, to just be here with neighbors, family, granddaughter, and try to help people move through doom as fast as possible to get to a place of post-doom, inspired local love and action. That's what I've given my life to the last 2 years. I've got 78 conversations that I've recorded. They're all available both in audio form and video form. So doom, a common feeling of ugh or dread upon realizing that technological progress and economic growth and development are the root of our predicament, not our way out. Doom is a name for the anxiety and fear called forth when living in a coronavirus era that triggers an economic depression. And then doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration, with or without us. That's what life does. It regenerates. I call it resurrection theology or compost theology. That's the way life does. It always does that. And with or without us, that will happen. Post-doom is what opens up when we remember who we are, accept the inevitable, honor our grief, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. Post-doom is a fierce and fearless reverence for life and relative equanimity, even in the midst of abrupt climate change, a global pandemic, and collapse of both the health of the biosphere and business as usual. And post-doom is living meaningfully, compassionately, and courageously, no matter what. I did a version of this after the last sermon where I had the Serenity Prayer for the 21st Century, and I've just changed the title, but sometime in the next week or two, we'll schedule an evening for those that didn't make the previous one or those that are interested, because this little 25-minute video is the best thing that I've created in terms of emotional support for those of us, most of us, experiencing climate anxiety and environmental dread. Here's the Serenity Prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. A lot of people don't know this next line: living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. And that was penned in the 20th century by Reinhold Niebuhr, a theologian. Thank you.
So now we turn to our story for all ages, which will be told by Connie Barlow.
Good morning. The title of this story is Helping Forests Walk. And for me, I'm a science nerd, it's a true story. Once upon a time, about 18,000 years ago, give or take a millennium, there were no trees here. There were no birds, there were no squirrels, there were no deer. Nothing was here in southern Michigan because we were covered with ice. There were no Great Lakes. 18,000 years ago, peak ice age. Now, fast forward about 6,000 years, and we get to about 12,000 years ago, give or take a millennium. And we've got the first peoples coming over. Now, the trees during the Ice Age, the peak Ice Age, had to all be south of here, way south of here, but they had thousands of years to slowly move south. Ice Ages come on over a long time. And when the Ice Ages were receding, we had a good 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years before things stabilized out. And so there were 5,000 years for everything to move back. Birds can get back fast, anything that can fly. Trees made it back too. Now, we're in a time now that's a bit faster, quite a bit faster, 10 to 100 times faster than these trees have had to move before during these ice ages. How are they going to move now? Well, that's where we get to the word or the term helping forests walk. And I picked that up from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a Potawatomi. Here from this region, though south of Michigan, is where her ancestors came on and were forced out by some of the colonizers, including My ancestors, I'm a sixth generation Michigander, so I'm sure they were involved. They got moved out down to Kansas, some of them, though some Potawatomi managed to stay around here. And what we know is that these people had a reciprocity with nature. When they had something that they were taking from nature, let's say acorns to eat, chestnuts to eat, pawpaw to eat, they would carry it with them as they moved. And so whenever they moved north, the boreal forest that was down in Kentucky and North Carolina, back when they first got here, they would move up as the boreal forest moved north, and they would carry the trees with them that they had a reciprocal relationship with. I just collected this outside the house here. I'm sure all the black walnuts, we have so many of them here in southern Michigan, got here because of the indigenous peoples bringing them north, the acorns bringing them north as well. Reciprocal relationship. So what does that mean for the future? The dominant culture I come from doesn't really have a reciprocal relationship with nature. Sure, we've got the pumpkins and the squash and the beans that the Native Americans genetically cultured into agricultural products, but walnuts, you just put them in the forest and they grow. Pawpaws, you put them out in the floodplain and they grow. A lot of things. And we consider them totally wild now. So we're in a time of rapid climate change. And a lot of people who, like me, consider themselves conservationists, love the wilderness. We don't think we should move native species even farther north because we're scared. We think that's not our job. But Robin Wall Kimmerer, she uses the term helping forests walk. And in the Guardian interview with her recently this year, she mentioned that she herself, in her own forest in New York State, up by Syracuse, she's a botanist and a professor at the State University of Syracuse. She's been planting more southerly trees, as have the Little Traverse Bay Ottawa Indians here in Michigan. So we have a lot to think about as to what's our role going to be. And frankly, I'd like to think that I'm a passenger pigeon who, before my settler ancestors extincted them, not knowing that they were killing them off, not knowing that, but these were the ones who carried the acorns. And so I would like to believe that I too can help forests walk, and maybe more people will join me in the future. May the forest be with you and with us in the decades ahead.
Thank you very, very, very much, Connie. And now we will extinguish our chalice. So Connie, would you please do that?